Greetings, I'm Cody Cook, and you're listening to Cantus Firmus at the Movies. A quick shout out to Patreon supporters Kelly Smith and Peter Mangle. For this episode, my guest is Dr. David Baggett. Dr. Baggett is a professor of philosophy in the Rawlings School of Divinity at Liberty University. Author, editor of over a dozen books, he's the executive editor of moralapologetics.com. He works in the areas of philosophy and popular culture, philosophical theology, philosophy of religion, ethics, and moral apologetics. His most recent book, co-written with his wife Marybeth Baggett, is entitled The Morals of the Story, Good News About a Good God. I'd also like to mention his involvement in the books Hitchcock and Philosophy, Harry Potter and Philosophy and Joss Whedon, which is part of why I thought he'd be a great guest in this podcast. Welcome, and thank you for joining me, Dr. Baggett.
Thanks, Cody. Great to be here.
You had picked the film Shadowlands, made in 1993, directed by Richard Attenborough, who also directed Chaplin and Gandhi and maybe more famously played John Hammond in Jurassic Park, and stars Anthony Hopkins as C.S. Lewis. So it is sort of a biopic about the relationship between C.S. Lewis and Joy Davidman. Davidman is played by Deborah Winger. I'll give sort of a very brief plot outline for those who may be sort of unfamiliar with it. It follows the friendship of the British writer and professor C.S. Lewis with the American poet Joy Davidman. Davidman had been an atheist communist before reading Lewis and traveled to the UK to meet him. On a return trip, now as a divorcee, she asks him to marry her to keep her in the country. After her cancer diagnosis, he realizes that he really does love her, and he struggles with the emotional pain of his inevitable loss and how that shapes his feelings about God. So when I contacted you, I'd mentioned your involvement in some of these books related to like Harry Potter and Hitchcock, and I said, yeah, you've kind of written and thought about the relationship of films and philosophy and that kind of thing, and sort of said, what was there a movie you might like to talk about on the podcast? And this is the one that you picked. So what was it about this film that really sort of stood out for you as being very relevant to how you think through some philosophical and theological issues?
Yeah, well, this is a great movie. I've enjoyed it through the years a number of times. It's beautiful. The music is beautiful. The setting is beautiful. Of course, it's about C.S. Lewis, and I'm a big fan of Lewis. And it's also pretty philosophical. It broaches questions concerning evil and suffering in the world, and not just sort of on a theoretical level, but a very personal level. And that's very true to life, because Lewis had written The Problem of Pain, but when he lost his wife after just a few years of marriage, he struggled with suffering in a personal way. And so it was very much that kind of pastoral or existential struggle with evil, not just a theoretical or philosophical question. So the movie really pulls at strings. It gets you thinking. It touches you. It moves you. It's set in an academic setting, which I also like, and at Oxford of all places, which I love the most. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the movie has just so many features that resonate with me, and I love thinking about it.
Well, and it's interesting in the film, through particularly these speeches or sermons that he's delivering, you sort of get a feel for how he is working through these issues, his transformations on the issue of the problem of pain. And so, early on in the film, you have him saying things like, pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And God doesn't particularly want us to be happy. He wants us to love and to be loved. He wants us to grow up. And he thinks that suffering helps us do that. He says that, God is like a sculptor. The blows of his chisel, which hurt us so much, are what makes us perfect. And then after the cancer diagnosis, he's, now says, if you love someone, you don't want them to suffer. Why doesn't God feel that way? And then, I'm afraid that suffering is just suffering after all, no purpose. At that point, he's, struggling a little bit with this idea of, maybe there, now that he's sort of feeling this pain in a very intense way, it's no longer theoretical, and he actually starts to like almost try on atheism here and there, which he does also in the two books, which are pretty fascinating to read, because you do get the problem of pain, this very theoretical view, and then his journal that he writes, A Grief Observed, after his wife dies. And he's sort of like working through all these different feelings and trying on all these ideas. Okay, well, maybe there isn't a God. He's like, well, that's obviously nonsense. Maybe God just, isn't very nice, and so he's kind of working through all these ideas, and they sort of show him doing that in the movie. The we're rats in God's cosmic laboratory, and in the book, I think he says something like, the experiment will turn out for our benefit in the end, but ultimately this would make God a vivisectionist. And yeah, so it's very interesting to sort of watch that transformation. And I have kind of my own thoughts on different ways that you could respond to the problem of evil, and things that have maybe helped me think through that. But it kind of made me wonder if maybe C.S. Lewis maybe it was somewhat inappropriate for him to speculate so much about why God would allow suffering, because once you're sort of in that moment, all that speculation starts to feel very kind of paltry. It's a bit like Job and his comforters, where they're all giving all these reasons why Job must have gone through all the suffering, and then there really isn't a very there isn't really an answer that's there that's totally satisfying, apart from just his suddenly experiencing God in a personal way again is sort of what pulls Job through it. And as a philosopher, I mean, do you tend to think that some of these speculations are helpful or appropriate, or does maybe C.S. Lewis's experience with pain sort of give the lie to that idea?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, on the one hand, I think it's very worthwhile for us to think hard about the question and attempt to come up with some potential reasons why God might allow various sufferings and such. And that's a worthwhile thing to do. It psychologically, it's practically impossible, I would guess, for us not to try. Mm-hmm. It's just kind of who we are as human beings, right? On the other hand, there really are these epistemic limitations that we're saddled with, and it's awfully difficult for us to come up with the definitive answers that we might want to find. And we have to come to terms with that not all of our questions are answered to our satisfaction in this world we see through a glass darkly, and that sort of thing. And that's difficult to come to terms with, especially if you're philosophically minded, I think. And C.S. Lewis certainly was. And we have to come to terms with the fact that the sort of deep, penetrating, definitive answers that we yearn for are probably not altogether available in this life. I mean, God doesn't necessarily promise to answer every last question that we have, at least right now. We continue to see through a glass darkly and the like. He promises, of course, to be with us through the various struggles and unanswered questions, but sometimes we just have to come to terms with the fact that we don't understand things fully. So what you have here in Lewis is a very philosophical thinker, who was actually trained in philosophy and whose cast of mind was in that direction. He wanted to ask those questions. He wanted to struggle. He wanted to venture some potential answers. But he also had to come to terms in his personal experience in his life with the inadequacy of some of those answers. As insightful as they were, there's still going to be leftover pain and suffering that's awfully hard to deal with, some unanswered questions. And that's very much what this movie is about. So in answer to your question, yeah, I'm a little torn. I think we need to try to think hard about these questions, but I think we have to do it with a certain measure of humility and recognizing our limitations, and so that we don't become altogether disenchanted if we don't get the answers that we would really like.
Yeah, what's kind of interesting is the film doesn't necessarily give a theological kind of definitive answer for Lewis that he lands on. I was reading through again A Grief Observed last night, and I guess I found that he doesn't necessarily come with a really strong one in the book either. It's just sort of something that after he works through that moment, he finds that he's able to experience God again. I mean, there are certain things he kind of does work through, as far as like it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense for if God is just this evil thing that wants to trap us, and his qualities are really, just terrible, it would seem strange that, he would create all these wonderful things that are what is like almost the bait, and he sort of lands on this idea that maybe the good things are really primary and the evil things are sort of aberrations. And so that, even if we can't necessarily totally understand what God is doing, there's a certain sense in which we just trust there is goodness there, that sort of makes sense to land on. In the movie, the way that he sort of comes out as, well, I don't really get all this, but I guess I'm glad that I need to be able to sort of accept life openly. Whereas his experience when his mother died when he was young was to sort of almost hide from it a little bit. He sort of comes to this conclusion that it's good to open yourself up to good experiences, even though they're not ultimately everlasting or whatever. There's always going to be some pain involved. Did you feel like there were any particular answers that Lewis landed on in the film, or any of his writing that you felt were at all satisfactory for this question, or at least helping sort of move part way to an answer?
Sure. Well, again, I think that if we bear in mind the distinction between the sort of theoretical challenge and then the personal emotional struggle, that's helpful, right? I don't think that Lewis ultimately found there to be any intractable theoretical difficulties with believing in the existence of a good God, even in the face of the terrible suffering in this world. It wasn't the theoretical question that he found himself really struggling with in this movie, in real life, in A Grief Observed. It was that personal, existential, emotional struggle. And I think that this is important for us all to remember, because we might have very decent answers as to why God might allow this or that suffering in this world. But obviously, if you come across someone who's just lost a child, you don't just start hitting them with the philosophy, right? You just don't say, well, here's a possibility for why God might have allowed your child to die, like you said earlier, and heartless. What you do in those moments is you embrace them, and you just spend time with them, and you allow them to grieve, and you grieve alongside with them, and things like this. This, by the way, is one of the insights from the movie. Powerful scenes near the end, where Douglas, the son, is sitting there in the wardrobe, and it's such an iconic scene, of course, because he had already made his way to the back of the wardrobe, hoping for all he was worth to see, Narnia open up, and it was a disappointment, of course. So there he was, sitting in front of the wardrobe, and Lewis's brother Warney had suggested to Lewis, just go and talk to him about the fact that he just lost his mother. And Lewis said, I don't know what to say to him. And Warney says, just talk to him, just talk to him. In other words, it doesn't matter so much the content of what you have to say, than the time with the person. His grief is the important thing. So Lewis goes up there, and it's a wonderful scene, of course, where the little boy is puzzled as to why his mother had to endure this. Lewis himself admits he doesn't know either. And then the little boy, Douglas, asks Jack if he believes in heaven, and Lewis says he does. And then the little boy says he doesn't. And then Lewis says, that's okay. That's instructive, because obviously we don't see clearest when our eyes are filled with tears, and the boy's eyes were clearly filled with tears. He was mourning the loss of his mother, and he didn't need a theological lesson at that moment, so Lewis just let that go. And then the boy started to cry, and he said, I sure hope I see her again. And Lewis says, me too. He starts to cry, right? No answers, just cries with the boy, and they hug, they embrace. And that is sort of the biggest resolution, just about the biggest resolution that you're going to see of these questions in this particular movie. I think there are yet more resources in Lewis's actual life and in his writings and whatnot. But with respect to this movie, that's about as good as it gets. That come alongside those who are suffering. Don't try to pretend that you know answers that you don't. Cry with them, mourn with those who mourn, and save some of those theological questions that you might have for later.
Well, that's interesting too, right? Yeah, Lewis doesn't. Another thing to sort of say about how he deals with Douglas is that he doesn't scold him. He's not only saying, that's all right that you're struggling right now, but I think there's a tendency sometimes for people to want to, correct people and put them on the right path, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And react very strongly to that sort of pain, which really compounds it.
Right.
I wondered, as I read and watched this film as well, I think to be able to say that God has a reason for allowing suffering that we maybe don't necessarily have access to, and so that deals with the logical problem of pain. I think I get that. That makes sense. although I think Lewis, and maybe it's his tradition as a Westerner or whatever, but he doesn't, say that in a more collective way. He individualizes it. It's almost like I am in the dentist chair, and the suffering that I'm going through will ultimately turn out for my good. Is it possible that that approach to individualize it so much maybe is less helpful? If you look to someone whose child was just murdered, and you say, "Oh, well, this was for your good." I mean, this kind of meticulous sovereignty that's sort of Calvinistic, but also very benevolent. I mean, does that, first of all, is it something that's going to be satisfying to hear? And second of all, does it necessarily make sense?
I don't think it's satisfying to give people that kind of answer, that kind of theoretical answer in the throes of their suffering. That's not the time to do it. Mm-hmm. I think that those really aren't the right times to ask those hard questions. Just let people grieve and so forth, And there's a big difference too between saying God is able to redeem an excruciating trial in one's life, and God specifically sent it in order to make you better or something like that. Mm-hmm. And there's something fundamentally flawed about that too. And by the way, Lewis has been criticized along these lines for some of what he has said in A Grief Observed. When you personalize it too much and you say, okay, like he suggested, well, God had to take Joy away because I was idolizing her or something like that. Mm-hmm. That's kind of making it a little bit more about himself than he should. So maybe he should have suggested one of the benefits that I might be able to derive from this excruciating experience is to learn that I shouldn't idolize, I should worship God alone and not allow my relationship with God to be dependent upon my getting what I want. But that's different from saying God did it specifically for this purpose to teach me that lesson. In general, I think that when people are suffering, we shouldn't come in all sorts of acting like we know more than we do, and let us provide you all of these answers as to why you're suffering. We don't know. But what we do know is that God is faithful through those times, and that He can be relied upon. He can be drawn closer to. God will be with us through those difficult times, and He can be trusted in the suffering. But that's very different, I think, from this presumption why this is happening. There's a lot of mystery there that we simply are unable to penetrate given our current epistemic limitations.
Sure. That kind of very meticulous sovereignty that God is doing this somehow for my individual good seems difficult, I think, to even imagine in certain instances. Mm-hmm. But I think,
and what about what about suppose your child gets raped? If someone says, well, that was a horrible experience for me to see that happen, but it made me better ultimately. Mm-hmm. I mean, the problems with that are just so obvious, right?
Yeah. But I think there is at the same time, like you said, that this idea of getting through the other side of it, and how do we get through the other side of it? Do we get through the other side of it saying that wasn't really an evil at all? That we're just composed of atoms, and if I sit on a chair or step on a floor, it's just as much of a violation, which is to say it's not at all. Or do we say that this was an evil, that there is a good God who is set on redeeming the evil in some way, shape, or form, and to speculate on why He'll allows this or that or the other thing is ultimately, in most cases, going to be fruitless.
Right. Evil should be a problem, right? And Christianity has a great explanation for why that is the case. This is a fallen world in the process of being redeemed. And so, of all people, I don't think Christians should trivialize or deny this category of evil things in this world. But our atheist friends have a different kind of problem of evil. It's not obviously the problem of reconciling the suffering in this world with God's existence, because they don't believe that God exists. Merely to cash it out in terms of pain or something like that, pain is very unpleasant, and that sort of thing doesn't penetrate to the depths of what's going on, because there are such things as moral evils in this world. More distinctively, moral categories and things like that. And you have to have enough worldview resources to really make sense of these things, of the depth of the badness of evil in this world. And Christianity, I think, has those resources, and I think our naturalist friends really don't. So the way Jerry Wallace likes to put it sometimes is that when the problem of evil for your worldview ceases to be a problem, that's an even bigger problem for your worldview. And I don't think it is open to that charge. I do think that a secular perspective really is, because I think ultimately the category of evil understood in moral terms does largely need more adequate backing and undergirding than what a secular worldview can provide.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think we have to acknowledge the existence of evil. I think, first of all, I think have at least a good reason in this arena for believing in God, which I think maybe seems, like a paradox for some people. But the very existence of evil itself requires the existence of moral categories, which again requires the existence of God, which is, I think, another reason why, this kind of, meticulous sovereignty approach can be a dead end, because it in a way makes evil something good. If God his hand is in everything, and everything which happens is meant for some greater goal, like is done for some greater goal, then that almost makes it not evil. It's actually just good in disguise. But I think to be able to say that there is evil in the world requires us to say, okay, well,
Yeah.
if there's evil, there's moral categories, and there's actual good, and what does that look like? And then the answer to that is God.
Yeah, good. So yeah, I think that's right. Evil really contrasts with good, right? Immanuel Kant made this clear, that there's a difference between mere badness, understood as, say, pain, and the category of evil, which is the more distinctively moral category, whose contrast is good. And so your worldview needs an account of what is ultimately morally good. And I think we really do have a very solid, robust account of that as Christians and as theists. And I do, in fact, of course, embrace something like a moral argument for God's existence. In fact, I think the moral arguments for God's existence and the problem of evil, they kind of go head to head, and one's going to win and one's going to lose. They're sort of locked in a zero-sum game. And I think the moral argument's going to win over this problem of evil deal, as formidable a challenge as it might initially seem to us. But in terms of this meticulous providence idea, yeah, I just want to affirm what you're saying and agree 100%. Yeah, I think that if you embrace a theology that says absolutely everything that happens is in precise accordance with God's will, and even what might appear to be evil, in fact, is actually kind of good, because God brought it about. God's not the author of evil and all of this. I think this is confusing God's ability to redeem evil circumstances with this notion that God brought them about again. And I think that we need to be very careful as Christians not to suggest in any way that God is the author of evil. He can redeem it, but it's not his will that these things would happen. And at least will, it's in his permissive plan, and he can redeem these things. But it's never the case that God sends people to perform sins or anything like that. I think that's just bad theology.
Yeah. What's kind of interesting too is, I don't know if you had read what's the name of the book? Well, it's actually called Joy, the recent biography that was written about Joy Davidman. And I had the author's name out here, but I seem to have lost it. It's what's kind of interesting is, the circumstances that sort of create their relationship, and you get this in the movie too to some extent, are not necessarily ideal, but there is something that's sort of good and beautiful that comes out of it, and also unexpected. And I wonder if there's sort of an analogy there for how we think about the less than ideal circumstances in which we live in this world, which nevertheless God is going to turn something good out of.
Yeah,
yeah,
I like that.
I know, and there was it's not entirely clear, but there's some speculation that Joy kind of had her aim on Lewis even as she was married to this other guy. That she was I think wanting to. She had feelings for him. She was attracted to him. Was already sort of trying to scoop him up. I think they try to suggest in the film that maybe that's not the case, because when they're sort of maybe aware that there are feelings there, she seems to not like it. Is at least like what she implies. But there's at least a little bit of speculation that was maybe her intention from the beginning, and sort of an unhappy marriage, and the guy who's an alcoholic and all the problems that were there. It's I don't know. It is. I think, some people have sort of cast negative aspersions on Lewis because of the relationship in and of itself. Nothing bad about it or immoral.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an interesting question how closely the movie actually was based on real life. We know they took some artistic liberties, and I don't know all the ins and outs of that relationship in real life myself. I wouldn't be probably the best person to reflect on that so much, but I sort of just take the movie as is and kind of assess it on its own merits. But it is interesting to point out some of the discrepancies, right? Like in real life, there were two sons, and in the movie there was just one. And of course, I'm sure that not every detail of that relationship, as it was fictionally depicted, corresponds with actual life. And then his friends that he was hanging out with there, and the bird and the baby, or wherever they were. I mean, you have this Christopher Riley character, who's a great character in the movie, but who doesn't really correspond with anyone in real life, as far as I know. And in fact, if anything, you might say his real life friends, the Inklings, Tolkien, Barfield, and Williams, and the rest, were probably far more interesting than, in general, his friends in the movie. They probably could have benefited from actually having his real life friends fictionally represented. I do know I heard that Tolkien was rather put off by this aspect of his real life, which the movie did capture, that he kind of kept it under his hat, that he had married Joy to extend his British citizenship to her. And Tolkien wasn't really informed of this until later, and he was a bit put off by that. Mm-hmm. So there was clearly something less than optimal in that relationship. I don't think there's any doubt about it. And C.S. Lewis was a human being, and he was capable of making some mistakes. And I'm not necessarily saying the marriage was a mistake, but maybe some of the aspects of the way in which he dealt with it, clearly less than optimal, less than perfectly functional. But it would certainly seem, like you suggested, that God redeemed the circumstances in a remarkable way and brought a great deal of good out of it.
Yeah. Well, the thing, too, I think about some of those questions of real life correspondence, and I know that oftentimes people get a little pedantic in their expectation of biopics to be, just like the details in real life. But I kept watching, trying to see, okay, is this supposed to be Tolkien, or and some of these I wasn't really sure. And even like in the Inklings, wasn't Dorothy Sayers an Inkling, or was that really just more of a male group? I know she was kind of connected to them.
Yeah, I don't think she was officially counted as one, but she was friends with them.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was completely a gentleman's club, or if it was a little bit more diverse than that. But
I'm pretty sure it was pretty much all males that were officially considered Inklings. I could be wrong, but I think so.
Yeah, but you weren't aware of anyone in the film that was in that sort of group that was really supposed to be someone in real life.
No, in fact, I think I had heard that it's not the case. That's just not something that they tried to do at all. And again, by excluding guys like Tolkien and the rest, I mean, that was a colorful bunch. I mean, my goodness, that could have been interesting side stories involving them. But in real life, I mean, those were really his closest friends with whom he fraternized on a regular basis, and they very much shaped him, and he them. And to leave that out of the story, it's perfectly fine. They can take artistic liberties in that direction if they wish and focus elsewhere. But to leave it out certainly did leave out a lot of interesting possibilities.
Do you think it's possible that they thought that if they had fleshed that out too much, it would have been maybe they wanted those relationships to be in relief, which is why they sort of treated them as sort of secondary and not very fleshed out?
My guess is that's probably right.
Well, and I think in particular, I think Joy is treated as bringing this sort of, new color to his life. And like, it's almost like they're trying to sort of say that prior to Joy, his life was kind of two-dimensional, and she sort of makes it three-dimensional.
I think that's right. I think that's the way they're depicting it. And again, I think that's a perfectly legitimate place for people to wonder about how closely to real life that corresponds. Because I suspect that that's if even if it's true, only a small part of a much bigger picture.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with that. What did you think of the film altogether, apart from its sort of philosophical themes, its treatment of characters and the way it's filmed and just kind of all those other details?
Yeah, I just think Attenborough did a marvelous job directing. I think the writing was really crisp. I rewatched it last night with my wife for probably the 20th time, and was struck again by how beautiful some of the dialogue is and how good some of the acting is. And I love the setting at Oxford and all that's represented there in terms of the intellectual life. Someone once said that Oxford is an embodiment of the nobility of the intellectual tradition, and I've always liked that. And it's a wonderful place to make a movie, and they really captivated the audience with all the shots that they took, all the beautiful music, the great dialogue, the impeccable acting. And so the whole cumulative effect of the movie is always very touching for me personally.
Yeah, I agree. It's what's kind of interesting about the film is it's not, a quick moving film or anything. It's a bit of a slow burn. You sort of are following the characters. What you're interested in is how they interact with each other, how they relate. I think Anthony Hopkins plays the role with kind of a I don't know. There's sort of a quiet dignity about it, I guess. You sort of feel like there's always something going on underneath, but he he plays the characters, kind of reserved in a way, but with something else underneath, which is I think difficult to do. How do you convey all of what's going on inside someone, without sort of exaggerating it externally?
Sure.
What you're interested in is, I think, always what's kind of beneath the surface, because the film itself is I think, a pretty slow moving film, but you're just so interested in how the characters are relating to each other and that kind of stuff. What's kind of going on beneath the surface.
Yeah, and Hopkins, I mean, for them to score him to play Lewis, I mean, that's a coup. Great actor. Max McLean, he does that one man C.S. Lewis show up in New York. We saw him last summer at Oxford, a C.S. Lewis conference over there at Oxford and Cambridge, and he said of Hopkins playing that role that Hopkins was playing Hopkins, but then he made it very clear that he wasn't criticizing that he thinks Hopkins is a great actor and so forth, but maybe he wasn't capturing Lewis so much as he was capturing himself in certain respects. But it was still very well done for what it was. Of course, the BBC also put out a version of Shadowlands, and this was a play, so this can take different forms and incarnations depending on who gets cast in the various roles and such. But the story itself really is so compelling, and I'm glad that it's been told in more than one way, and with more than one person playing Lewis. It's really a story that's worth telling and worth pondering.
Yeah, absolutely. There's kind of a side plot, like a B plot in the film, which is Lewis's relationship with a student who's, seems kind of uninterested in the Oxford life a little bit. And I kept trying to figure out exactly what that was there for, what that was supposed to convey. And, Lewis takes on a somewhat paternal relationship with the character. I didn't know if it was maybe, kind of foreshadowing that, he had this sort of paternal interest that would sort of, be useful later with Douglas. Or I was trying to kind of just make a connection with what exactly that was supposed to be. How did you sort of see that? Why that was there for?
Your suggestion is an interesting one. I had never thought of that. I had always thought of it in terms of this, that Whistler sort of recognized that Lewis was so comfortable in his role as teacher that usually when he would ask a question, he kind of already knew the answer. And so Whistler said, "Look, I don't see things as clearly as you do," and he kind of wanted to work things out on his own. And so, at one point, when Lewis felt exasperated with him and said, I don't know what people are wanting from me or something like that, Whistler said, that's the first time you've asked a question where I don't feel like you already have the answer to it. Mm-hmm. And you'll recall the parallel here with Joy when they were going to the hotel. And he said, "Are you happy?" And she said, "Yeah." And he says, "What kind of happy?" And then she says, "Oh, yeah, I forget. When you ask a question, it's because you already have a particular answer in mind, And then that becomes a kind of a cute, funny, winsome scene between those two. But the point is that, again, as fictionally depicted, Lewis is sort of pictured here as a guy who's got to figure it out. And it was maybe good for him to get knocked off course a little bit to realize that he didn't have all of the answers, that everything wasn't quite as neat and tidy as he had thought. Again, I'm not suggesting that the real life Lewis was actually like that, but that's definitely the angle that they were going for in the movie. And so I think that at least is part of what they meant to flesh out with Whistler, the student.
Yeah, it seems that maybe when you read A Grief Observed, that Lewis maybe feels that way a little bit about himself, that maybe he had been knocked off his his sort of confidence about, what he thought he knew and understood a little bit. That's interesting. That makes sense. That there's kind of these sort of, characters who are, I guess in a way, sort of perceived as having it a little less together. Joy's a bit brash. The kid's kind of a bad student, a little bit arrogant, maybe. But at the same time, I guess maybe they're trying to suggest that, Lewis is portraying a kind of confidence, almost maybe an arrogance that, that's unhelpful. That maybe he's I don't know. That's interesting.
Yeah. No, I like that a lot. With the student Whistler, kind of a bad student, right? But there's another sense in which, he had this passion for reading books and he wanted to read them all night. And remember, his hands would tremble when he would open a new book. Does the author feel what I feel and see what I see and so forth? Well, so he leaves. He doesn't finish his degree. Lewis is very disappointed at all of that, but he goes on. And when we see him later on the train, he has become a teacher himself. And unless he's just wrong, says, "Yeah, actually, I think I'm pretty good at it." And Lewis says, "I suspect you're something of a born teacher." And so maybe even some of the conflicts that Lewis had with the guy was exactly because this guy, by wanting to chart his own course and figure things out for himself and really think issues through and come to his own conclusions, maybe it didn't make him the best student. Maybe it led to some conflicts. But it also may have contributed to him being such an excellent quality teacher himself later down the line, right? So there's all of that at play.
Yeah. That's that's an interesting relationship in the film.
Hey, can I say another word about A Grief Observed, Cody?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because you had mentioned that, and it really is remarkable. If listeners have not read juxtaposed Lewis's Problem of Pain and A Grief Observed, they really should, because it is really fascinating to see this guy first struggle with the problem of evil and intellectually, and then in his personal journal, and that's what A Grief Observed originally was just his personal journal, really struggle with evil in that personal way. And it's a whole different ball game. And I think that readers would be amazed to see that the same guy who wrote Mere Christianity and who constructed the moral argument and who wrote A Problem of Pain and talked about how God whispers to us in our conscience, but shouts to us in our pain, also wrote A Grief Observed, where he says, among other things like, what good reason do I have other than my desperate wish to believe it, that God is actually good, when all of the evidence points to the contrary? I mean, the same guy wrote this stuff. And like you were mentioning earlier, in A Grief Observed, he does come to something more of an emotional resolution with some of those struggles. And in fact, even if you look at it carefully, you realize it was the very next day that he turned his back on some of those ideas that were going through his head. But by articulating them, he made us privy. He kind of gave us an insight into what was going on in his mind in the throes of grief. And in so doing, he really did us a great service, because we can see in all of the particularities of his very intense emotional struggle with evil, things that we recognize within ourselves, right? There's something very universal about the particularities involved here. And we can see that, look, if even someone like C.S. Lewis, who'd written one of the premier seminal works on the problem of evil, could so struggle, with a personal challenge with suffering, then it's okay when we struggle too. And we can trust that God will be with us through it all.
That's good. I kind of a related question is whether or not there's a moral component to that struggle. I think all of us know people who have, maybe had bad experiences in the church or went through, a time of severe grief, and not, they don't always come out at the other end, still having faith. I have friends that I can say that of, kind of popular in sort of the popular Christian world, I guess, a little bit. The musicians that were married, Sandra McCracken and Derek Webb, and the husband was unfaithful. They ended up divorced. He came through it an atheist, and she came through it still, believing in God. And so you kind of look at these experiences that we have, and I think we Christians do tend to say that there is a moral component to belief or unbelief. Do you think that how does that sort of factor in when you're dealing with issues like suffering and pain?
Yeah, well, yeah, this is a good and challenging question, right? Because someone might mistake, say, a theoretical challenge to faith with something that is more psychological, existential, or perhaps even moral, right? I have a friend who tells the story of a friend of his that he had at seminary who came back after one summer, all very skeptical, about his faith and whatnot. But lo and behold, come to find out, the person had begun to live with his girlfriend, unmarried, over the summer. And that moral choice actually kind of began, at least so thought my friend, skewing this guy's perspective, which it can. So sometimes we can use excuses like, well, I've got these intellectual doubts or whatever, or look at this suffering that I've endured, in order to gravitate to a view that you might down deep really want to hold, because it's going to liberate you, from some of those moral constraints or strictures that Christianity would impose. I don't want to, in any particular instance, insist that this is the case and that I know it's the case, but there's good reason to think that at least sometimes this dynamic is operative. And I think that it's good for us to be aware of that, so that we can be self-aware enough and honest enough with ourselves, so that when those struggles come, we don't wrap with, these legitimate intellectual garbs, something that at root is something much more visceral, something much more emotional, or perhaps even something like a moral failure. Yeah,
I agree with that. Yeah, I think sometimes we will turn personal guilt into an objection to God, and then we sort of look to rationalize it with arguments. And I've seen that too. I had a friend who went through a bad experience with a breakup with a girl, and his not long after that, he told me, well, I still believe in God because I don't have any reason not to, but I think of myself as a Christian hedonist now because I'm just not really interested in following that path. And then, before long, he's picking up Dawkins and everything else, all this stuff he knew about before. It's not as if there were new arguments, but suddenly the argument seemed more satisfactory because there was an emotional for them too.
Yeah, I mean, and this is something of which we all need to be aware. We're not just logic chopping machines. We are volitional creatures, relational creatures, emotional creatures, spiritual creatures, and there can be all sorts of contributors to the beliefs that we form and hold and cherish. And we always like to think of ourselves as making purely rational, dispassionate, logical decisions, right? But in point of fact, that's relatively rarely the case. It's much more complicated than that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, so if God can be patient and understanding when we're in the throes of pain and we're sort of dealing with these the issues of theodicy and all that other stuff, um, is it possible also that God is patient and understanding and even forgiving if we don't always come out of the other side of it in faith, or what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. Well, look, I think that God loves everybody. I think it's not his desire that any should perish, and I think he does everything short of overriding our freedom to draw us to himself. I think that intellectual doubts are fine, and if people are experiencing those, it doesn't mean that God loves them any less. I don't think God's up in heaven fretting that people aren't believing in him or something like that. I mean, the devils believe in God. He wants a whole lot more than merely our intellectual assent. He wants a relationship with us. And so, yeah, I think he remains absolutely patient with all of us, despite our rebellion, despite our sin, despite our disbelief, our lack of faith, and all the rest. But until we make a definitive choice against him, I think there is hope. And I think God is ready and happy and willing to take any small little element of openness to him and fan it into a greater and greater flame. I don't think he's just looking for an excuse to relegate us to perdition. I think he genuinely loves us. And, nowadays, it's a bad rap when you start talking about God's love, because you get accused of domesticating the concept or watering it down. Yeah, but God's also a God of wrath and justice and holiness. And he is. But none of those things are independent of his love. And I think that all of us need to really come to terms with this fundamental fact that this is who God is. God is a God of essential love. It's not just what he does, it's who he is. And before we were ever around, and before there was ever a world over which he could be sovereign, he was essentially love. He is essentially love. And so God loves you. God likes you. God wants a relationship with you. And he doesn't delight in sending anyone to hell. It wasn't his desire originally that any human being would go to hell. It wasn't originally meant for us. It was meant for Satan and his minions and the like. If anybody ends up in hell, it's an utter tragedy. And it will only be because God's overtures of love were consistently resisted to the bitter end. And that is a tragedy indeed.
Hmm. Well, that's could be a good place to close. But if you have any, do you have any other thoughts about the film or any of the issues that come up with it?
Oh, just one little neat image in the film that I thought was cool, and this has to do with this idea that he kind of opened up more, than he was originally. You might even miss this little detail, but at the beginning of the film, do you remember when he's in his classroom and it's kind of like he's in his element and he's got these prepackaged answers and so forth and so on, and Whistler's not at all happy about it. But the little detail that I would point out is how Lewis closed his window. Mm-hmm. You might not have noticed this. He closed his window and then he taught his class. And at the very end, he goes and he meets with the student that he's going to tutor. And they go up in the office and they start talking. And he asks the kid some open-ended questions. And it wasn't like Lewis knew what the answers were. He really was curious to hear what the kid had to say, and the kid ventured some answers, and then Lewis said, "Go on," and then he walked over to the window and he opened it up, and that was just a neat visual depiction of some of what they were going for in this movie. That as time went on, he really seemed to open up more, acknowledge some of his own limitations, and develop more of an interest in hearing what others had to say. Just kind of a cool thing that a movie can do.
That's good, and I actually missed that. What's actually funny is that scene in the end, when he goes to the window and opens it up and he says, "I'm listening." I remember actually thinking sort of the opposite, which was, well, he says he's listening, but he's going over to the window and looking outside. It doesn't seem like he's very interested. But I think you're right that if I would have paid attention to how that was bookended, I would have thought, oh yes, he actually is open. He's opening himself up to the world, and he's So these sort of outside things. That's actually.
I think that's
good.
probably right.
I think you're right. I think that's great. Wow. Okay. So, Dr. Baggett, you also, your most recent book actually just came out this month, I think, is The Morals of the Story, Good News About a Good God.
Yes.
And that's related to these issues of moral apologetics as well, right?
That's right. It's a distillation of a couple books that Jerry Walls and I did, Good God and God and Cosmos. And my wife and I did this particular book with IVP Academic, and we try to make our fourfold moral argument more accessible to a wider readership. And it's also got a little bit of the rich history of the moral argument in there as well. So, yeah, we're happy with how it came out, and it's been received pretty well so far, and looking forward to more people taking a look.
That's great. And for those who may be somewhat unaware, the moral argument has to do with the idea that goodness and even evil actually are pointers to God, because if they are real, then they have to be founded in something.
Yeah, we identify a range of moral phenomena in need of explanation, and we argue that theism generally, and Christianity in particular, provides impeccable resources to explain these things, and explain them very well, from good to evil to moral agency to moral transformation, and there are others beyond those too.
That's good. And I'll just throw this out here, just kind of as a question. I know it's not as traditional an argument, but I wonder what you think about the idea that the incarnation itself is something of a defeater for the problem of evil, that the evil and pain that we experienced was taken on personally by God, so that on an existential level, the idea of God as sort of this distant cosmic vivisectionist is sort of undone by that.
Oh yeah, I think that has tremendous potential, both at the theoretical level and the practical existential level. When you're going through something and you realize that you don't have the answers, and it's almost too much to bear, just to remember that God himself was willing to endure sufferings for us that make our sufferings pale by comparison, and that there's a glory to come as a result of what he was willing to do, that will make the sufferings of this world small by comparison. That's something really to hold on to in the darkest of moments. So yeah, I think that speaks powerfully indeed to both the theoretical and the practical problem of evil.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being willing to do this with me, Dr. Baggett. And it was great talking to you, and a great film choice in a film as well, because this had been my list to watch, but I hadn't watched it yet.
Oh, terrific. Well, it was a joy speaking with you, Cody. Hopefully we can do it again.